Have you ever misjudged someone or something just by how they looked? Have you ever feared something only to one day realize it was the very thing that could save you? This is not just a story about a dog and a man. It's about scars, visible and invisible, and how trust, once shattered, can still be rebuilt. Welcome to Veil Marks, where we tell stories that move hearts and open minds. Today's video carries a powerful emotional lesson, so stay with us until the very end. Because sometimes the most unlikely friendships carry the deepest truths, and the kindest hearts come with the roughest pasts. The rusted gate creaked faintly in the morning breeze, casting a long shadow across the dew-soaked yard. Behind it stood Bruno, a scarred, broad-shouldered pit bull with a gaze that could quiet even the bravest mailman. His golden-brown coat bore old wounds like faded memories etched into skin, and his eyes, dark and deep, flickered with a mix of fear and fierce loyalty. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just stood there, still and silent, as if bracing himself against a world that never quite gave him a chance. In the quiet neighborhood of Maple Grove, where flower beds were neatly trimmed and porch swings rocked gently on painted decks, Bruno was an outlier. People whispered when they passed the corner house on Hemlock Street. "That's the dog from the shelter," they said, "the one they used in fights." Parents pulled their kids closer. Joggers crossed to the other side of the road. It didn't matter that he hadn't hurt anyone. It didn't matter that he hadn't even growled. He was a pit bull, and for most people, that alone was reason enough to fear him. But Bruno wasn't just any pit bull. He was a survivor. Found chained beneath a collapsing porch in a forgotten backyard 2 states away, he had once known only cruelty at the hands of humans. When the rescue team finally broke through the rusted chain-link fence and carried him out, he was half his weight and too weak to stand. The scars on his legs, the chipped canine tooth, the notched ear, each was a chapter in a story no dog should ever have to tell. But he lived, and perhaps that was the cruelest part, surviving a life where love had never once been spoken in his direction. Emily Harper didn't care about the rumors. In her mid-20s, with paint-stained jeans and a quiet smile, she had always seen the world a little differently. To her, Bruno wasn't a danger. He was a soul in need of a second chance. She saw past the breed, past the scars, and past the stories. The first time she met him at the shelter, he wouldn't come near her. He simply stared through the fence with haunted eyes, as if questioning her sincerity. But she waited. Every day, she came back with the same patience, the same soft tone, the same open hand. And after 2 weeks, he took one cautious step forward. That was enough. Now, Bruno lived with her in the yellow cottage with the sunflowers by the mailbox. He had his own bed near the back window, a box full of rubber toys he never played with, and a routine that gave him comfort. Morning walks before sunrise, peanut butter at noon, and evening naps under the willow tree. But despite all this, he never forgot what the world had once been. He didn't trust easily, especially not men, and especially not the one across the street. Jake Thompson had lived on Hemlock Street longer than anyone. A sanitation worker for the city, he was known for his reliability and silence. Tall, with silver hair and hands weathered by time, he moved with the weight of someone who had carried too much for too long. A Vietnam veteran and a widower, Jake rarely spoke unless necessary. His eyes, though still sharp, carried a sorrow that had dulled their sparkle years ago. He didn't dislike dogs, at least not in theory, but pit bulls, he had told himself, were unpredictable, dangerous, too much muscle, too much mystery. He had seen too much to believe in second chances. From his porch each morning, Jake would sip his black coffee and glance across the street where Bruno would sit quietly behind the gate. The two would lock eyes, just for a moment. Neither would move, neither would smile. Just an acknowledgement. "I see you. I know you don't trust me. I don't trust you either. There was a strange symmetry between them, one that neither of them would ever admit. Both bore invisible wounds, carried from wars they never chose. Bruno, from the blood-stained rings of underground dogfights. Jake, from battlefields and hospital rooms where comrades didn't return. They had both learned the same lesson early. The world was not always kind, and kindness, when it came, always felt like a trick. To the outside world they were polar opposites. A dog feared for his breed, a man hardened by war. But if anyone looked closely, truly looked, they would see two souls standing on opposite sides of the street, equally broken, equally misunderstood, and equally afraid of being hurt again. Bruno didn't growl when Jake walked by. He didn't bark or lunge. He simply stood there, motionless, tail still, eyes steady. And Jake, though his fists would tighten just slightly, never quickened his pace. He kept walking, but something about the way Bruno watched him stirred a memory he couldn't shake. The way his son's military K9 once did the same. That quiet readiness, that searching look. Emily noticed, of course. She noticed everything. How Jake had started watching Bruno with a little less suspicion. How Bruno, once rigid and nervous around the sound of boots, now stayed calm when Jake's heavy work shoes clinked on the sidewalk. She didn't say anything. She simply let time do its work. Healing, she believed, wasn't loud. It was slow, gentle, earned. And so the days passed, quietly, like the hum of wind through pine trees. Bruno stayed behind the rusted gate. Jake stayed across the street. But in that quiet space between them, something unspoken began to grow. Not yet trust, but something softer. A question, maybe. A hope. In a world quick to judge, quick to fear, and even quicker to forget, there they were, a scarred Pitbull and a weary old man, two strangers connected not by words or actions, but by a silent understanding that only the broken could truly recognize in each other. And that perhaps was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Jake Thompson was the kind of man who carried his grief in silence. You wouldn't know it by the way he moved. Steady and deliberate, like someone who'd built his life on quiet routines. Each morning he slid into his city-issued overalls, laced up his work boots, and grabbed his thermos of coffee before heading out to his shift. Most people in the neighborhood barely noticed him. He kept to himself, always polite, but never lingering long enough for conversation. If you passed him on the sidewalk, he might nod. But there was something in his eyes that kept most people from asking how he was. Something heavy, something buried. Years ago, Jake had been a father. He didn't talk about it. He didn't need to. On the wall above his small kitchen table was a photo frame that hadn't been touched in years. Inside it was a picture of a young man in fatigues, Jake's son, Tyler, grinning beside a strong, alert dog wearing a military K9 vest. They were somewhere overseas, desert stretching out behind them, the sun casting sharp shadows across their faces. In Tyler's arms was a Pitbull, tan and white, with a pink tongue lolling out and a gaze full of loyalty. That photo was taken 3 weeks before Tyler died. The details of the explosion were sparse. Jake received a call from a military liaison, heard the words IED and immediate impact, and everything after that became a blur. What haunted him most wasn't the official report or the folded flag they handed him. It was the image that stayed behind, the picture of his son cradling that dog. The same breed Jake now saw across the street each morning. The same broad chest, the same strong jawline, the same misunderstood eyes. For a long time after Tyler's death, Jake couldn't look at dogs, especially not pit bulls. There was too much wrapped up in them. He couldn't separate what the dog represented from what he had lost, so he didn't try. He shut that part of himself away and went on with life, cleaning storm drains, scraping graffiti off park benches, changing streetlight bulbs. He became a fixture in the background of the city, a man who did his job well, never asked for anything, and gave little of himself in return. People assumed Jake was just another aging worker, someone with sore knees and an early bedtime. They didn't know that he once laughed loudly, that he used to make up songs about toast just to make his kids smile, that he'd taught Tyler how to throw a football and how to treat every living creature with respect. They didn't know about the long nights he spent sitting in the dark with his wife before she passed, both of them too heartbroken to speak. Jake's world had become small, predictable, safe in its routine. And he liked it that way until the dog moved in across the street. Bruno was a force, even in stillness. There was something in the way he carried himself that was both proud and broken. Emily, the girl who had adopted him, tried to downplay his history, but Jake had heard the whispers. Former fighting dog, rescued from a raid, used for illegal matches in some abandoned warehouse across state lines. Jake didn't need details. He could see it in the dog's posture, the way his ears perked at every sound, the way he flinched slightly when someone walked by too fast. That wasn't the behavior of a house pet. That was the behavior of something that had been used. Bruno had scars, too, not all of them visible. He'd been chained so long the fur around his neck had grown back unevenly. His tail had a crook at the end like it had once been broken and never healed right. But it was his eyes that haunted Jake the most, eyes that mirrored a kind of sorrow Jake understood all too well. Emily was doing her best. Jake could see that. She took him for slow walks, talked to him in a gentle voice, brought him treats he sometimes refused to touch. She gave him space when he needed it, and comfort when he allowed it. But no matter how much love she offered, Bruno remained distant, guarded, like he didn't believe this new life was real, like he expected it to be ripped away at any moment. And Jake got that. He really did. Because you can't just wipe away years of trauma with warm blankets and a full food bowl. Healing doesn't happen on command. It's not linear. Some days are good. Some days you wake up feeling like maybe you can breathe again. Other days it feels like the walls are closing in, like one wrong word will shatter everything. Jake had lived in that place. Bruno, it seemed, still did. There was a day, not long after Bruno moved in, when Jake stood at his window longer than usual. He watched as Emily knelt beside the dog, brushing his fur gently while whispering something he couldn't hear. Bruno didn't respond. He just sat there, still as stone, staring off into nothing. Jake knew that look. It was the same one he saw in the mirror for years, that expression that said, "I'm here, but I'm not sure I'm meant to be." In that moment, something shifted for Jake. Not a huge change, just a flicker. A softening, maybe. He didn't wave. He didn't go outside. But he stopped hating the sight of the dog. He stopped blaming him for wearing the same face as the one in the photo. Because deep down, Jake realized, Bruno wasn't the enemy. He was a reflection. A reminder that pain doesn't make you dangerous. It just makes you human. Or, in Bruno's case, something deeply close to it. And maybe, just maybe, it made room for something else. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But recognition. The first step toward healing. For them both. The storm rolled in without warning, blanketing Maple Grove in a heavy curtain of rain and thunder. The sky turned a muddy gray, and the streets shimmered with reflections of brake lights and puddles. It was the kind of afternoon that made people stay indoors, sipping coffee behind fogged windows. But Jake Thompson was not most people. Storm or not, his job didn't wait. He was at the far end of Hemlock Street, crouched down beside a storm drain near Emily Harper's corner lot. Wearing his worn yellow raincoat and rubber gloves, Jake tugged at the iron grate, inspecting the rising water levels. The rain had started coming down harder, and he cursed under his breath as he adjusted his footing on the slick pavement. Years of routine had made him good at this. He could clear out a blocked drain in under 5 minutes. But today, something felt off. The street was quiet. too quiet. At that very moment, behind the fence of the yellow cottage, the latch on the backyard gate jiggled loose from the weight of the wind. Bruno, who had been quietly watching the world from his usual spot near the tree, stood up. The wind carried a strange scent. The air felt different, charged. A loud crack of thunder shook the house. The gate creaked open an inch, and Bruno stepped out. He didn't run. He didn't bark. He simply walked, cautiously, ears up, body low, as though even he couldn't believe he was free. The rain soaked into his fur, darkening the patches on his back, but he barely noticed. His eyes scanned the street, alert. Then he saw Jake. Jake, unaware of the loose gate, was tugging at a cluster of leaves tangled around the drain. His boots slipped slightly, and he reached out to steady himself on the curb. In that instant, his foot caught the edge of the slick asphalt, and his body pitched forward. The grate beneath him rattled. He flailed instinctively, trying to grab something, anything. But there was nothing but air. Bruno reacted before he thought. With a sudden burst of energy, the dog charged across the street, paws pounding against wet concrete. His muscles tensed, years of fight-or-flight instincts rising all at once, but this time, not in fear, not in aggression, this time to protect. Jake didn't see Bruno until it was too late. As he toppled sideways, expecting the harsh embrace of pavement or worse, he felt a sudden jolt. Not pain, but impact. Solid, warm. Something braced his fall. His hip met the sidewalk with a dull thud, but it could have been far worse. Through the haze of rain and surprise, he saw the shadow looming over him. Broad shoulders, strong chest, soaked fur dripping over calm, focused eyes. Bruno. Jake froze. For a second, his heart stopped. The stories he'd heard, the photo of Tyler with the Pitbull overseas, the fear he'd buried deep, it all surged back at once. And here was this dog, the same kind, inches away. Bruno didn't growl. He didn't bark. Instead, he took one careful step forward and pawed lightly at Jake's shoulder, just once. Then he stepped back and sat, almost military-like, as if waiting for permission to move again. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He sat up slowly, blinking water out of his eyes, staring into the face of a dog he had once feared, avoided, silently judged. The rain poured harder, but the world had gone quiet. No sounds but the rhythmic patter on the street and the hum of Jake's own heartbeat in his ears. "What?" he whispered mostly to himself. Bruno tilted his head slightly. Not curious, not playful, just present, attentive, alive. Jake didn't move, he just stared. The dog stared back. It wasn't a challenge, it wasn't a threat. It was a question neither of them had words for. From the front porch, Emily appeared with a panicked shout. "Bruno!" Her voice cracked as she ran barefoot through the rain, slipping as she reached them. Her eyes widened when she saw Jake sitting upright and Bruno watching over him like a guardian. "I'm so sorry," she said breathlessly, grabbing Bruno's collar, expecting resistance. But the dog didn't move. He stood calmly, allowing her to leash him without so much as a twitch. Her hands were trembling. Jake shook his head slowly. It's okay," he managed, his voice low and uncertain. He didn't do anything wrong." Emily looked at him, confused. "He didn't—" Jake nodded slowly, still stunned. "He stopped me from falling, or at least made it not worse." He paused. "He came to help." Emily's eyes welled up. "He's never done anything like that before." Jake looked at Bruno again, still unsure if what had happened was real. But the longer he sat there, the more the moment sank in. For the first time in years, a Pitbull, this Pitbull, hadn't been a reminder of death or trauma. Instead, he'd been something else. A protector, a presence, a bridge between memory and healing. Jake slowly got to his feet, wincing slightly but otherwise fine. Bruno watched him, then turned toward Emily as if his duty was done. As if to say, "See? I'm not who they said I was. And Jake saw it. This wasn't an act of instinct or chaos. This wasn't an attack. This was a moment. Unexpected. Undeniable. A crack in the wall that had separated them for so long. The first time they looked at each other not through fear, but through surprise. Through humanity. Or maybe, just maybe, through something even deeper. Recognition. The rain had long since passed, leaving the streets of Maple Grove washed clean and glistening in the early morning light. The storm drain where Jake had slipped was now clear, water trickling through it steadily, as if nothing had ever happened. But something had happened, something neither Jake nor Bruno could quite explain, and it lingered in the quiet moments that followed. The very next day, Jake did something unexpected. He rose early, as always, dressed in his city work uniform, packed his lunch, and poured his coffee into the old dented thermos his son once gave him. But before stepping off his porch, he paused. On the kitchen counter was a plastic bag of peanut butter dog biscuits, leftovers from a time when Tyler was alive and training dogs for the Army. Jake hadn't touched them in years, hadn't even opened the bag. Without fully understanding why, he grabbed one. On his way out, Jake crossed the street instead of turning toward the utility truck parked on the corner. The morning air was cool, with mist still curling around the lawns. Bruno wasn't outside yet, so Jake knelt quietly and placed the dog biscuit on the front step of Emily's porch, near the spot where Bruno often lay in the afternoons. He didn't leave a note, didn't knock, just turned around and went to work. By the time Emily opened her front door an hour later, the biscuit was gone. She didn't say anything to Jake, but she noticed the change too. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. A small treat, sometimes a biscuit, sometimes a bit of cooked chicken Jake had saved from dinner, would appear on the front step, and each time Bruno would sniff it carefully, then eat it with slow deliberation, his eyes glancing toward the street where Jake's truck usually sat, as if trying to piece together a mystery he didn't know he was a part of. Bruno no longer barked when Jake approached. That, in itself, was nothing short of miraculous. Before, the very sight of the man in uniform, the heavy boots, the utility vest, the scent of oil and asphalt, had made Bruno stiffen, growl low, or retreat behind the porch railing. But now, when Jake passed by, Bruno didn't move away. He didn't growl, he didn't flinch. Instead, he waited. He sat calmly, head tilted, eyes tracking Jake's movements with quiet curiosity. Some mornings, Jake would slow his steps, nod toward the dog, and offer a soft, barely audible, "Hey there." Bruno didn't reply. But he didn't run either. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would wag his tail once, just enough to be noticed. Emily saw it all unfold from her window. She didn't interfere, didn't try to encourage it or explain it. She understood that what was happening between Jake and Bruno wasn't something that could be rushed. It wasn't friendship yet. It wasn't trust. But it was movement. A slow, gentle unraveling of two tightly wound hearts. There was a softness to Jake now that hadn't been there before. He still worked long hours, still kept to himself, but his shoulders seemed to carry a little less weight. His eyes, once shadowed by grief, now lingered a second longer when he looked at Bruno. There was no pity in his gaze, just quiet recognition. And Bruno had changed too. He was still cautious, still instinctively alert. But when Jake came near, something about his posture softened. The rigid stance he once held had eased. His breathing stayed calm. He even began lying closer to the edge of the porch, the space where the boundary between him and the world had always existed. It was as if the wall between them was slowly being dismantled, brick by careful brick, without either of them needing to say a word. One Thursday afternoon, Jake found a small, slightly muddy tennis ball on his route. It had rolled under a storm grate near the park, likely abandoned by a child or a dog that had lost interest. Jake picked it up, cleaned it with the sleeve of his jacket, and later that evening, without fanfare, left it on Emily's porch next to a biscuit. The next morning, the ball was gone. Bruno had taken it. Jake didn't see him play with it. But a day later, he noticed the ball tucked under Bruno's paw as the dog lay on the porch, half asleep in the sunlight. It wasn't a game, not yet, but it was something close. For the first time, Jake smiled to himself. The street remained the same. The trees still swayed in the wind. The gutters still needed cleaning. But between one man and one misunderstood dog, something invisible was shifting. Something that spoke not of commands or training, but of quiet patience and mutual understanding. Emily could feel it too, even though no one said it aloud. Healing was rarely dramatic. It didn't come with trumpets or applause. It came with small moments. A biscuit on the step, a dog who didn't bark, a man who dared to soften. It came in the way they saw each other now, not through fear, but through quiet acceptance. And on the porch of the yellow house, Bruno waited each morning, not just for a treat, but for the man who once feared him, and who now, perhaps, was beginning to see him differently. The afternoon light poured through the living room window in golden streaks, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. The rain had passed 2 days ago, but the air still held the quiet aftertaste of storm, cool, still, heavy with things unsaid. Emily had made tea, though neither she nor Jake seemed all that interested in drinking it. The mugs sat untouched on the coffee table between them, steam curling lazily toward the ceiling before fading into the silence. Jake sat hunched on the edge of Emily's couch, his hands trembling slightly as he rubbed them together. Across from him, Bruno lay curled near the doorway, his chin resting on his front paws, watching everything without moving. His eyes flicked from Emily to Jake, alert but calm, patient in a way only animals seem to know how to be. It had taken weeks to reach this moment, weeks of shared glances, small gestures, and quiet rituals. And now, finally, Jake was here, in Emily's home, facing the dog he once feared, and the woman whose compassion had gently, persistently, unraveled his defenses. Emily sat in a nearby armchair, legs tucked beneath her, her voice quiet. She wasn't pushing him to speak. She never did. But the silence between them today was different, not awkward, not empty, just waiting. Jake exhaled slowly and looked down at his hands. "I don't usually talk about him," he said at last, his voice rough and low. "My son." Emily didn't say anything, just nodded once, letting him go on. "He was 24, bright, strong, stubborn as hell. Joined the Army right out of high school. Said he wanted to work with dogs, K-9 units. Thought it'd be better than infantry. Safer somehow." Jake laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and dry. "Safe? That's a joke." Bruno stirred slightly, but stayed where he was. "He used to send me pictures," Jake continued, "of him and the dogs. Always said they understood him better than people ever could. There's one photo I still have, him kneeling next to a tan Pitbull, arms slung over the dog's neck like they'd been friends forever." He paused, swallowing hard. "That was the last picture I ever got." Emily felt her chest tighten. She didn't speak, just leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap. "They told me it was an IED, Jake said. Quick. Probably didn't feel a thing. But they never found the dog, just my boy." His voice cracked, the weight of the memory pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing. "After that, I couldn't be around dogs, especially not pit bulls. It hurt too much. Like they all carried his ghost in their eyes." He looked across the room at Bruno, who still hadn't moved. "Then your dog shows up. Quiet, scarred, doesn't trust anyone. And for some reason, he saves me. Doesn't know me, doesn't owe me anything. But he stays." Jake rubbed at his face, blinking back the tears that were beginning to well. "I didn't know how to handle that. I still don't." Emily's voice was gentle when it came. Bruno doesn't know how to handle love either. Not really. He was raised without it, taught to fight, to fear, to survive. He flinched when I tried to hug him the first time, wouldn't let me touch him for weeks. But he still came to you. That means something. Jake nodded slowly. He's got a good heart. Same as my son's. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled only with the soft ticking of a nearby clock and the distant hum of passing cars outside. And then, slowly, hesitantly, Bruno rose to his feet. He walked over to Jake, not with the bounce of a playful dog, but with the solemn purpose of one who understood what was being shared. He stood before the older man, looking up at him with those same dark eyes that had once seemed so dangerous. Jake hesitated. His hand trembled as he lifted it, hovering uncertainly over Bruno's head. Emily watched, not daring to move. Then softly, he touched the dog's fur. Bruno didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he took another small step forward and gently rested his head on Jake's knee. And that's when Jake broke. His shoulders shook. A sob escaped before he could stop it, years of grief crashing down all at once. But he didn't pull away, didn't push the dog aside. He let Bruno stay, let him offer that simple, steady presence that words could never replicate. Emily sat quietly across from them, her eyes misting over, her hands pressed to her chest. In that moment, the room held 3 lives. A young woman who believed in second chances, an old man still trying to make peace with his past, and a misunderstood dog who had never known love but gave it anyway. There were no grand apologies, no declarations, just a shared silence, heavy, fragile, sacred. And in that silence, forgiveness found its way in. Not through words, but through the weight of a dog's head on a grieving man's leg, and the stillness that said without question, I see you, I understand, and you are not alone anymore. The sky was beginning to dim, casting long golden shadows over Maple Grove as the sun dipped behind the trees. It was one of those early fall afternoons where the air was cool, crisp, and carried the faint scent of burning leaves. Children's laughter echoed faintly down the block, bouncing off fences and mixing with the occasional rustle of wind. Inside Emily's house, things were quieter. She was folding laundry near the window when she noticed Bruno pacing in the yard, restless, tail stiff, ears pricked. His usual calm demeanor had given way to something more urgent, more anxious. Every few seconds he'd glance toward the road, then back toward the alley that ran behind the neighborhood. Then he started barking. Bruno wasn't a barker. It was one of the things Emily had always appreciated about him, how still and quiet he was. But now, his voice cut through the air with sharp intensity, not aggressive, not playful, desperate. Bruno? Emily stepped outside, wiping her hands on a dish towel. He barked again, louder this time, then took a few steps down the driveway, stopped, and turned back toward her. His entire body was tense, as if he was trying to say something and couldn't find the words. He barked once more, then started trotting away. Emily hesitated only a moment before dropping the towel and grabbing her jacket. Okay, I'm coming. Bruno led her down the block and around the corner to the far side of the neighborhood, the area near the industrial storm drains, where city crews often worked. Her heart started to race when she spotted a familiar pair of work boots lying just beyond the chain-link gate that bordered the access road. "Jake!" she called out. No response. She hurried forward, and that's when she saw him, collapsed halfway down the shallow concrete incline, motionless, his safety vest soaked in sweat and dirt. Bruno was already there, circling him, whining, nudging his hand with his nose, trying to get him to respond. Emily dropped to her knees. "Jake, can you hear me?" She touched his neck and felt a weak but steady pulse. His face was pale, lips slightly blue. The faint smell of something chemical lingered in the air. Gas or sewer fumes, maybe. Whatever the source, it had overwhelmed him. She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911. As they waited for the ambulance, Emily sat beside Jake, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. Bruno didn't leave his side. He lay next to him, pressed close, his head resting near Jake's shoulder, eyes wide but calm, refusing to move. He kept vigil, as if silently promising, "I've got you." The sirens came quickly, their wailing slicing through the air like a blade. Neighbors began to gather at a distance, murmuring, pointing. "Is that the dog?" "That's the Pitbull, right?" "I thought he was dangerous." But none of the whispers mattered now. Bruno didn't bark, didn't growl. He stood calmly as the paramedics loaded Jake onto a stretcher, his eyes following every movement. When Emily reached out to clip the leash back on, Bruno didn't resist. He didn't want to leave, but he trusted her. The hospital was a blur. Tests. IVs. A doctor with a kind voice explaining that Jake had likely inhaled toxic fumes from a backup in the storm drain. If he hadn't been found so quickly, the outcome could have been far worse. Hours passed. Bruno waited outside the ER with Emily, sitting patiently by the bench as the night grew colder. He didn't sleep, just watched the door. Eventually, a nurse came out with a tired smile. "He's awake. Asking for you." Inside, Jake looked pale but alert, propped up on a thin pillow with wires running from his arms. His eyes lit up when he saw Emily. "You okay?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. He nodded slowly, then gestured for her to come closer. She pulled a chair beside him, and for a long moment they just sat in silence. Finally, Jake turned his head and asked, "The dog, is he all right?" Emily smiled, her throat tightening. "He's fine. He wouldn't leave you." Jake closed his eyes for a moment, swallowing hard. His hand found hers, fingers trembling slightly. "You know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "my son always believed in pit bulls. Told me they were loyal to the end. I never understood it. Not really." He opened his eyes again and looked directly at her. "Now I do." Tears stung Emily's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She simply nodded, her heart full. Later that week, when Jake returned home, the neighbors had changed their tone. The dog they once whispered about with fear had become the hero of the block. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Bruno now paused to offer a nod or a kind word. Some even brought him treats. Kids waved to him through fences. But Bruno didn't care about any of that. He only cared about the man in the work boots who now knelt beside him each morning with a biscuit in hand and gratitude in his eyes. The man who no longer feared him. The man whose life he had saved. Because in the end, loyalty isn't proven in perfect moments. It's revealed in the ones where everything falls apart. And that day, Bruno showed the world exactly who he was. The days that followed Jake's hospital stay unfolded like the first breath after a long storm. Quiet, fresh, filled with something unspoken but deeply felt. Life on Hemlock Street didn't change overnight, but for those who looked closely, the signs were unmistakable. The man who once walked with his eyes to the ground now moved with a subtle lightness in his step. The dog who had once sat in shadows now greeted the morning with his head held high. Bruno had become a symbol, not just for Maple Grove, but for something bigger. His story had quietly rippled through the neighborhood, passed along in conversations at backyard fences, and whispered between old friends on front porches. The Pitbull, who once inspired fear, was now a daily reminder of second chances. Every morning, Jake would step outside just after sunrise, a soft biscuit in his coat pocket and a leash in his hand. Bruno would be waiting, tail gently thumping the porch. They walked together, not just through the neighborhood, but through the remnants of their old selves. Two survivors of different wars, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of each other's company. It was Emily who first suggested they visit the local rescue center together. "There's a lot of dogs like Bruno out there," she said one afternoon as they sat on her porch, Bruno curled between them. "Ones that need patience, structure, someone to believe in them." Jake looked down at Bruno, who had his head resting across Jake's worn boots, eyes closed, completely at ease. "You think I could help?" Jake asked, voice cautious. Emily smiled. "I think you already are." So he went. At first, Jake just observed, standing quietly in the corner as volunteers worked with anxious, trembling dogs that flinched at every sound. But slowly, something opened in him. He began to speak, to kneel down and let the dogs sniff his hands, to recognize the same fear he'd seen in Bruno, and once, in himself. He wasn't loud. He didn't give orders or flash confident smiles. But the dogs responded to him, drawn to the calm steadiness in his presence. One by one, they started approaching him first. Emily watched it all happen with quiet pride. The man who had once recoiled at the sight of a Pitbull was now kneeling in the straw beside one, teaching it how to trust again. Bruno came with them often. At the shelter, he wasn't just another dog. He was a story, a legacy, a living example that change was possible. His presence gave hope to the volunteers and comfort to the new dogs who saw, perhaps for the first time, what love looked like. One afternoon, a formal letter arrived at Emily's house. It was addressed to Bruno, C.O. Emily Harper, and Jake Thompson. Inside was a note from the mayor. It thanked Bruno for his role in saving Jake's life, praised his courage, and declared him an honorary good citizen of Maple Grove. Emily laughed when she read it aloud, tears in her eyes. Jake held the letter in both hands for a long moment, nodding slowly. "He earned it," he said simply. Word of Bruno's transformation spread further than anyone expected. People who had once crossed the street to avoid him now stopped to pet him. Children called out his name from school buses. Elderly neighbors who had once drawn their curtains whenever he passed now invited him into their yards, offering treats and gentle scratches behind the ears. One woman, a retired librarian who had once written a complaint to animal control about Bruno, now brought him a fresh biscuit every Thursday. But perhaps the most striking change of all was in Jake. He smiled more. Not the kind of quick, polite smile that disappears as fast as it comes, but the kind that stayed in his eyes, that softened his whole face. Neighbors noticed. One even remarked to Emily, "I haven't seen that man smile in 10 years. Emily just nodded. She understood. Sometimes in the evenings, the three of them would sit on Emily's porch, bathed in golden twilight. Bruno would stretch out on the wooden boards, resting his head across Jake's lap, his breath steady and slow. Jake's hand would move gently through the dog's fur, an unconscious rhythm of comfort and affection. Emily would sit beside them, a mug of tea in hand, watching the two souls who had once been so guarded, now resting in complete peace. She didn't say much during those moments. She didn't have to. She knew exactly what had happened. Jake had found something he hadn't realized he was missing, not just companionship, but trust. Not just a routine, but purpose. And Bruno, in turn, had found something even rarer, someone who saw beyond the scars, who loved him not in spite of his past, but because of it. As the sun dipped below the trees and the street grew quiet, Jake would sometimes murmur, "He's not just a dog, you know." Emily would nod. "I know." Bruno, nestled against the man who once couldn't look him in the eye, would sigh deeply, safe, loved, and finally home. And in that stillness on that porch, beneath a sky slowly fading into stars, they all understood something beautiful. Healing doesn't come all at once. It comes slowly, quietly, and always, always with love. Jake found healing not in words, but in the quiet loyalty of a misunderstood dog. And Bruno, once feared and broken, found a home in the heart of a man who had sworn he never would. As Maya Angelou once said, People will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Veil Marks to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. A small milestone, but one that deeply encourages us to keep creating meaningful, high-quality stories just like this. Every like, every comment, every sub is fuel for the soul. Until the next story, stay kind, stay open, and never stop believing in second chances.